Hey guys, thanks for checking out another episode of Tales from a Small Town Journalist, the podcast dedicated to all the unique and strange and fun and weird and wonderful stories that you are only going to hear about from small town community newspaper reporters. I am Matt Schorr and I will be your host up until I hung up my boots, so to speak, and became just a weekly humor columnist for the Leaf Chronicle newspaper. I did newspaper journalism for about 10 years. I was a reporter, a photographer, and finally an editor before it was all said and done. And my biggest takeaway from that, one of my biggest takeaways, I should say, is that reporters and just everybody who works for small community newspapers, they really have some of the most unique experiences. The sort of stories that you're not going to hear about from big metropolitan newspaper reporters, and most definitely not the sort of things that you're going to hear about from television studio reporters either. Before we go any further, this is a listener-supported podcast, supported by wonderful folks just like you. One of the best ways that you can support us is, of course, by spreading the word. Social media is an effective way. Use Twitter, use Facebook, use Instagram. Do everything you can to spread the word and let people know how great you think we are. Rate, review, and subscribe. That would be great as well. Leave us some kind words and a 5-star review, just to help boost the algorithms, as they say, and put the word out just how wonderful we are. And finally, word of mouth is always great as well. So, tell a friend, tell a loved one, tell a random person on the street. Put the word out there how great you think this podcast is and how everybody out there definitely, absolutely needs to be listening. This last month, I got to attend my first ever local comic book convention. I've been to a few in the past. I actually got to be a part of the Superman celebration last year over in Metropolis, Illinois, and I was also part of the SalukiCon at Southern Illinois University. And those are really fun. You get to meet a lot of like-minded comic book fans like yourself. Just in case anybody out there doesn't know, I'm a huge comic book geek. So that was a really fun experience. But when it's a local one, it's just a little bit more special, I think, because in addition to just once again meeting fellow comic book geeks like myself, I was able to meet people who are my neighbors, people who I probably crossed paths with at the grocery store and just never knew that they were comic book fans just like myself. But if you happen to come up to my booth and check out any of my books that I had there, I'll just go ahead and do a quick little plugs for myself, like Moby Dick Back from the Deep and Jesus Christ, Demon Slayer, or my kids' books like Attack of the Zombie Source Rex. If you did happen to check any of those out, thanks very much. And also, it was great meeting you, and I hope to do it again. Also, the following weekend, this was really cool, I got to be a part of Free Comic Book Day over at Rick's Comic City in Clarksville. I actually was part of Rick's Comic City's Halloween Comic Fest the previous year, so it was really cool going back. Free Comic Book Day is always a great day, getting free comics and seeing just once again, fellow comic book aficionados like myself. It's just a great time. If I saw any of you guys there, it was great meeting you, and definitely hope to do it again. So for this podcast, we're going to be talking to Eric Walker. Eric Walker is a sports reporter for the Mayfield Messenger newspaper. Once again, just a sort of an illustration of how unique the experiences of small town reporters can be. Eric currently works for a newspaper that I used to work at, and yet we've never really worked together. Even though we've been aware of each other for a long time, we just never happen to work under the same umbrella. It seems to be a unique thing with small town reporters, perhaps with reporters of all at every level, but I don't know, maybe just a little bit more aware of it because small community newspapers are constantly crossing paths and covering the same things whenever it's some kind of a regional event or whatever, especially when it comes to sports. So Eric's told me a little bit about what we'll be talking about today. We'll be discussing one of the times that he was actually a part of a police investigation, helping out with some of the photos that they had to take. That's something that I never experienced, I have to say. There were times that I took photos of crime scenes, but I did it strictly as a reporter. They had their own guys there taking photographs, and they're very clear on where the line was and that I didn't need to cross it. But Eric actually got to step in there and take some of the photos that they would use. We'll try not to get too morbid with some of this stuff, but I gotta admit, I'm very curious about how this goes. And of course, since he is a reporter, a sports reporter, I should say, definitely want to hear about the unique aspects of small town sports, particularly in high school. One of the things that I remember growing up in a little bitty town in West Kentucky, the same one that Eric works at now, is that small town high school sports, it's almost like a second religion for a lot of people. So I really look forward to this conversation. Let's not waste any more time. Let's get Eric on the phone right now. All right, I am here with Eric Walker, sports reporter for the Mayfield Messenger, and a little bit of a twist that just kind of reflects small town life being the way that it is. I'm not sure if Eric knows this, but his wife actually babysat me a few times when I was a child. And
I do know this.
now he works for the newspaper that I used to work for. Life is funny sometimes, isn't it? How are you, Eric?
I'm doing good. Yes, life does come full circle, and I have heard plenty of stories. And
None of them are true.
I guess if you could, maybe slip me a 50 or maybe even something a little bit bigger, that I will not. I will refrain from telling any of those stories.
Now you put me in a tough spot. Well,
Yeah.
I'll just have to soldier on here. Well, we talked a little bit before we got started. Eric was telling me some of his unique experiences when it came to some crime scene photography that he actually got to do. I showed up for a few crime scenes, but I don't think I ever got to the point where it was questions whether or not the police wanted me to use the photos or not. I always showed up after they were finished. So I'll let you elaborate more on this. Tell me about this time that you ended up taking some crime scene photos that police actually needed to get their hands on.
Yeah, well, this is, when you introduced me as working with sports, this is actually my third incarnation or tour of duty with the Mayfield Messenger. Whenever I first started, this was back in the early 90s, and I was the staff writer, kind of the third wheel, so to speak. Didn't necessarily have a beat that I would cover related to the city or the county. So I would just kind of fill in if they ever needed anything, either with photography or with feature writing, or, something happened and they needed somebody else to kind of step in and work with. That was kind of my role as staff writer. This was probably, it had to be around the time when our main crime reporter, Jim Abernathy, he was either busy at the time and couldn't take the call, or may have been on vacation. Periodically, yes, we do get to take vacations in the journalism trade. But yeah, we just had the police scanner on in the newsroom, and so we're listening to it, just kind of as background noise. Then we hear the call that there's been a dead body reported at a local housing authority, and so the editor looks at me and says, why don't you run down there and see what you can get a picture of? And primarily going in, you're thinking, well, you'll just kind of get a shot of maybe the street, maybe some of the houses in the background, the police presence there, and that's just going to be it. So going in, that was my thought. And I drove down to where the police were and went up, made my introductions. I knew some of the police officers and they knew me, so it wasn't anything where I was kind of going in blind, or they were kind of saying, who's this guy? So I made my way up there and was talking to them and just kind of getting some pictures, told them what I was doing and everything, and they were fine with that. And then one of the police officers came up to me and said, listen, we don't have a camera with us, and we're probably going to need some photos of the scene. Would you mind taking some photos for us of the body? And so I'm like, sure, I can do that. In my mind, thinking this is not going to be a big deal at all, because I've watched TV, I've watched movies, I know what dead bodies look like. And so they said, okay, now and this was during the summer too, so keep that in mind as well. So they tell me that there's a smell, so the only thing that they had to let me spread under my nose to kind of block the smell was icy hot. So I've got this icy hot on underneath my nose to kind of mask the smell and everything. And sure enough, there was a dead body on the bed. Apparently, it had been there for a while. And I went in. It was a bit of a stretch for me to go and do that. But I took the pictures. They directed me on what they needed and everything. And that was it. Went back, developed the film, and handed them over as all part of the evidence that they needed to collect. So that was my first stint venturing off into that kind of macabre realm of police photography or police reporting that sometimes does crop up from time to time in small town newsrooms.
Everybody has to be a jack of all trades, and they have to
That's
be
true.
that. They have to be that in newspapers anyway. But I feel like in a small town newspaper, they really have to be that.
Yeah, you almost kind of hear about, if you want to say the olden days, whenever, like the volunteer fire department, or even like the people would come out in kind of the bucket brigade, if there was a house fire or a building on fire or something like that, and everybody pitched in. It does kind of have that same type of feel whenever you're working in a small town newspaper, that, sometimes you may be roped into actually helping out the people that you're covering whenever they're in a pinch.
Absolutely. I remember the thing that I did that I disliked the most was courtroom proceedings. First and foremost, because so many of them, you had to get there and wait 2 to 3 hours sometimes for something that was only going to take 2 minutes. So that was tedious on its own. But then there were the quote unquote more exciting, the times where you actually covered an actual trial. And I think I hated that even more because you're there all day and you're just barraged with just all kinds of negative, I don't know, not to sound too hippie-ish, but just negative energy in so many ways because it's like it's all reports about this violent crime that happened. And one of the things that I remember, you mentioned the photography you took. I remember distinctly several cases where I didn't take the pictures, but they actually brought up the photography that the photos they took to review everything. And it just, I don't know, it's, even though you're not there, it's just a picture. It's, I think just the knowledge of what was there just really, it hit me on a bit of a subliminal level. Like I was not traumatized by it, but I kind of walked away with this sort of just nasty feeling inside, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I guess, and again, kind of dipping the toes into the morbid side of it. It's imagery, and in a way, it's like art, not in what you would want to hang on a wall or something, but I mean, it does convey a message, and just like art, you're going to take something away from it, whether it's positive or negative. I think that's apt of how you're describing it. So it's just an image, almost like if you would say watch something either particularly violent or even uplifting on a movie or TV show or something like that. It's that visual that just kind of gets embedded in your brain and in your psyche, and so you are either uplifted by what you see or kind of oppressed by what you see. So I can totally get that.
On a somewhat lighter note, but still on the police side of things, I remember one time I rode around with the Mayfield police on one of their, day-long drug roundups, which sounds negative, but there really is a funny side to this. At the end, like you had to get up at like 5 in the morning. It was brutal. I rode with them all over town, and you don't have an appreciation for all of just the nasty parts of your hometown until you go to all of them within about a 2-hour stretch.
Right.
And the part that always stuck with me at the end of it, by around 11 o'clock or toward noon, they had this sort of makeshift check-in station, I guess you could call it, where they were booking everybody and getting all their mugshots and everything, and they were doing it in the City Hall Council chambers, of all places, which is already kind of amusing in itself.
Yeah, exactly.
But what I distinctly remember was walking in there after all this just nasty stuff I had seen all day, and I walk in the council chambers and I see all these people getting booked and just looking pitiful and forlorn and just awful. And then right in front of all these people in chains and handcuffs, there's this stack of McDonald's breakfast biscuits. Dozens of these things just piled up, and officers are like picking them up, opening them up, and chowing down on them. And I walked up to one of them. I said, it's not enough that you're going to arrest them. You're going to enjoy this food right in front of them that they can't even touch.
That's right. This is your view of the last bit of freedom.
Yeah, he just threw his head back and laughed, jammed a biscuit in his mouth, and then just with a mouthful of it, just said, "Yep."
Yeah, just if you got to rub salt in the wound, you got to rub salt in the wound.
Oh, they rubbed a lot of it. I think they were really enjoying themselves a little bit too much, quite honestly.
Yeah, I can definitely see that.
Did you ever have to go on any of those roundups?
No, and that's one of the things, like I said, being kind of the third wheel, Jim Abernathy, who was crime, and that was kind of his beat. And so if it was a sheriff department raid or, sometimes the police, he would go out, get these calls at night about, something going down. He would, of course, at that time, things were a little bit easier in regard to the relationship between law enforcement and the media. So they would call him up, or he'd hear it on the scanner, and because he was very religious in the upkeep of the scanner, even in quote unquote away from the office. He would pick up these things and then go out on site if they were making some sort of bust, if there was some sort of hostage situation, something like that he would show up. And, it wasn't anything that I was like, hey, I'd like to do that, because that was his thing. I'm very big on, if that's your beat, if that's the area that you're covering, by all means, let that be what you are, the area that you are the master of your domain. And so I certainly wasn't going to cross lines of that. But there was one time whenever he was going to be, we had a missing person, a missing elderly man, and he was going to be out of town or otherwise occupied and wouldn't be able to go take pictures on this particular night. That was the night that they ended up finding this man. He had been, died from exposure. And he heard about it, called me and said, hey, can you go out and take a picture of this? And, he told me the location of where they had found the body and everything. And so I went out to take that. And again, it was a situation where, walked up, I knew some of the police officers who were there. I think either the chief of police, John Davis, or maybe at that time he was still assistant chief. He was there on site as well. And we just talked, and he said, look, I can't take you down there to see the actual body, but if you want to get a picture of them bringing the body back on the gurney back to the ambulance, then by all means we can do that. So I think that's the picture that I ended up getting. That was just one of those things where I was on call that night. But nothing as exciting or maybe even traumatic as being there whenever something like a drug bust or a roundup was going down.
Well, all told, you really weren't missing a lot.
Well, yeah, but still, it's one of those things where you can look back and recount a story like you were telling.
I guess there's that. That's true.
Yeah.
One other thing I remember so much about that, at the time, the Messenger published at noon, and one of the times that I went on one of those roundups, it all ended in time that we were able to get it in that day's paper. So the same day of the roundup, the report got in the newspaper, and I had a bunch of compelling photos, but we just ended up doing just this full spread of every single mugshot that they had, which was far more compelling than any photo I could take.
Right, yeah.
And of course, every rack sold out, and I remember standing in line at the grocery store and hearing people talking to one another about they knew somebody that got arrested. Like, do you hear this person? They were arrested today. Look, here they are right here.
Right, yeah. And I remember back whenever the police logs were like holy text that you ran in the paper. So every morning, that was one of the first things that somebody had to do was physically go to the police department, pick up a list of the police reports from the previous day. So they could be traffic citations, they could be accident reports, they could be, arrest reports, and come back and you would type those up for that afternoon's paper. And that was almost like people gathered around to read it. And it wasn't just who got arrested. It was like who was involved in a traffic accident at the intersection of 9th and College. And then, of course, the funny part of that was people who would call up and want to see if they could get their names kept out of the paper, not because they were arrested, but because they had a traffic accident. And it's just like, look, everybody has fender benders. Everybody has an accident now and then. But believe me, there's no need to call up and plead and then berate somebody just because it's like, look, I'm sorry, we can't take your name out of the police blotter. It's in there. It's public record, and that's what we print.
I am just old enough to remember those because I think that sort of got it phased out when I was at the Messenger. So I can remember before and after.
Yeah. It was like I said, it was almost, one of the first things that people would read whenever they pick up the papers. They'd open up to page 2 and read the police reports.
Well, we've talked quite a bit about crime, which, as I understand it, is you've done that part-time, but it's sports that really pays the bills for you. Am I right?
Oh, well, pays the bills is a little bit loose terminology, but yeah, it does give me a little bit of pocket change.
Pays the bills at least as far as it can be considered in journalism, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So yeah, let's dive into some of your experience there. There's got to be some amusing tales there. For instance, the city you cover, Mayfield, had some major excitement this last basketball season.
Oh yeah, with the city school Mayfield boys basketball team going up to Rupp Arena to represent the first region in the boys Sweet 16 basketball tournament. That was so huge. It was actually the last time that they had reached the state tournament was the year before I had moved to Mayfield, so that was 1992. And this was a team that a lot of people looked at and thought that eventually they were going to probably at least have a good shot at getting a chance to go to the Sweet 16. My first year back, again, this is my third tour of duty. Second is working in sports. Whenever I started back and working with sports this tour, the team had reached the first region tournament championship against crosstown rival Graves County. Played an overtime game. It was a fantastic game. Mayfield came from behind there in the fourth quarter to force overtime, but eventually Graves County won. Kids who were the seniors this year were sophomores that year. They had a really good team last year as juniors, but ended up losing in the regional tournament's semifinal. So this was kind of like the last year that they had their opportunity to reach that goal of going to the state tournament. the boys coach, Chris Guy. This was going to be his final year before he was going to retire. So there were a lot of elements that just kind of came together and played into adding some of the mystique to this year's boys basketball team.
Couldn't have booked it better if it had been pro wrestling, right?
Exactly. Yeah. All you just really needed that good foil, that good heel that you could beat up on. But yeah, it was a really, really great season for them, and it was nice to be a part of that.
I remember when I graduated in, we won't worry about that. The big thing that I remember was Mayfield and Graves in football. Mayfield had not lost to Graves for as long as I could remember. And I just distinctly remember the year after I graduated, they lost to Graves in football. And it was so historic at the time. And I told people, look, I'm not going to say it's because I left, but, it's food for thought.
Right.
Even though I never set foot on the football team, but,
Yeah, there was probably some sort of connection there. Was it the 20th century that you graduated?
It might have been.
Okay. All right.
I will neither confirm nor deny that claim.
Understand. Yeah, and of course, football has such a storied legacy here in Mayfield. Of course, this year we lost one of our legendary coaches. Coach Paul Leahy passed away.
Oh, and there are so many stories about Coach Paul Leahy.
Oh, yeah. And
gosh.
I'll tell you what, you'll appreciate this. Before we were doing this interview, we went to Dairy Hill for the first time of the year, which is kind of like the local ice cream burger joint on the outskirts of town, a little shack. And while we were there, we ran into a couple, and they were, I think one person had graduated from Mayfield, and then his wife was a transplant, and he was telling her some of the football stories that involved Coach Leahy, and I was telling some of the stories that I had never heard and then heard during his memorial service. Coach Leahy was just one of those larger-than-life characters that was, if you had to think of a stereotypical football coach for high school, you could probably draw him up.
He was all of them, wasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. Big, burly, red-headed Irishman. There was not a curse word that he did not like and was not afraid to use, told stories. And the things that, again, telling these stories and some of the reactions were like, well, he wouldn't be able to do that now. He wouldn't get away with anything like that. And I was like, well, it was a different time, grabbing a kid by the helmet face mask and holding him up off the ground straight armed and his feet were dangling beneath him and, or going to a track meet because a kid didn't perform well and so that the team got a, regional title. The kid was left behind, that type of thing, and you're all just kind of like, oh my gosh, but at the time, you look back and think, even the people whose, this happened to, it's one of those funny, small town stories that just causes and creates a legend and allows it to grow to almost some mythical proportions.
Oh, yeah, and just to further add to that myth, my father had a story where he encountered Coach Leahy during one of those Little League football games that they used to have. I'm sure they still have them every year at War Memorial. I mean, these are 8 to 10-year-old kids playing football as 8 to 10-year-old kids are going to play football. And my brother happened to be in the league at the time, and I don't know where Dad crossed paths with him. It was either in the stands or the hallway that leads to the locker rooms. But Coach Leahy just bumped into him in the hall and just so enthusiastically, as if he were watching the Super Bowl. And in that, burly Irish brogue just says, wasn't that just a great game? Coach, they're 8 years old. It couldn't have been that great.
Exactly. And there were just always these stories. And one of the biggest things was, for me, whenever I was working as the sports editor, was weekly we would do a preview of the upcoming game. So, on Tuesday, I would go down to Coach Leahy's office, and we would sit there, and I'd, just conduct an interview with him. Well, generally, there would be maybe another assistant coach that might come in, and they would kind of needle each other while I was doing this interview. So there would always be these stories about whenever Coach Leahy and his early days of being a teacher, and you would get paid just once a month. And so they would end up burning through most of their money after the rent was you bought beer for the rest of the month. And then they would say, you know, as it was getting close to the end of the month before the payday, then you were really struggling as far as putting food on the table and everything. And he and his roommate would go out and they would hunt, and he would say things like, we would eat things that, or we put things in our skillet that would make the clampets, you know, throw up, you know, that type of thing. And like you were saying, in his Irish brogue and that burly, booming voice that he had whenever he was telling these stories, I mean, it was just hilarious. Then at his memorial service, whenever he actually had his family come in, his brothers, and his brothers, I swear to you, sounded and looked just like him.
Oh, that's great.
And so they also had this real gruff, booming voice as well. And I'm listening to it over the radio. They broadcast it live, another, you know, small town thing that they would broadcast this memorial service. And so some of the stories they were telling about whenever they were younger, and I think they were going to go into Chicago. Of course, they were originally from up in northern Illinois, and they were going to go into Chicago for a weekend. And so they're driving into town, and this was, I guess, probably back in the maybe mid-'60s, early '60s, something like that, and came across a Holiday Inn which had a restaurant, and the advertisement was all-you-can-eat fried chicken for $1.99. So they're like,
sign of the times.
Yeah, they're like, you know, how great is this? We can eat all the chicken that we want, and we only have to pay $1.99 for it. You couldn't beat that. So Coach Leahy, his brother, and I think a couple other guys, and so they go in there, order up a platter of chicken. So the waiter brings a platter of chicken. Brother gets 2 pieces, and all the other guys get 2 pieces, and the platter goes to Coach Leahy, and he eats all the chicken. So they order a second platter, same type of thing. Bring the platter, everybody gets 2 pieces. Coach Leahy gets the rest of the platter. So they call the waiter over again, says, we'd like some more chicken. And finally the manager comes over, and he says, no, that's it. You've had enough. Coach Leahy goes, what do you mean? And he said, it's all you can eat. And the manager says, that is all you can eat. And again, you're thinking, yep, I believe every single word that you're saying, and this could only happen to you. And I'm sure that in the time and listening to it, you know, play out in real time, that was just one of the most incredible and hilarious episodes that he would fall into was something like that. Being as big and burly, yeah, you could just see it play out.
Yeah, I can definitely see it. He, just to add one more story to his legend, he actually taught me, whether he knew it or not, one of the important life lessons that has always stuck with me ever since high school. I'm sure you know this. He taught world civilization for I don't know how many years. But one of the things he taught our class that I had never heard put this way before, he was telling us, I don't know what country we were talking about at that point, what tradition and culture about it we were discussing, but he said, and just in case anyone in this class thinks that what these people do for a tradition is weird or silly, I want you to remember one thing. Every Easter, to celebrate the ascension of Christ into the heavens, we have our children going out in the yard and looking for colored eggs that were left by some kind of bunny.
That's true.
I have never forgotten that explanation. Anytime I see a culture that I think is kind of odd, I always remember, well, Coach Leahy said.
That is so true. That is probably the truest thing that I've ever heard. I've never heard that story before until now. And you're right. That is probably one of the quintessential universal truths that I will take with me from now until forever.
Yeah, you'll hear it in his voice, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, that one and the story about the old lady in the bathtub during a tornado was one of his favorite stories to tell every single year.
And that's one of those that I've got to get somebody to tell me because I've never heard that one either.
You haven't heard about the lady in the bathtub? Oh, I can recall it as best I can. It was a tornado that struck somewhere where the team was playing, and I do not remember the region. And they were on the field when the tornado hit, so they evacuated into the gym, I guess, to take cover. And his joke was like, you guys look at me now, and I was not built much different then, but I could have outrun Jesse Owens that day. And then he proceeds to tell us, like, now I've been accused of lying about this, but there was some old lady taking a bath when that thing hit, and it just yanked her right out of her bathroom, threw her across the field. And when they found her afterwards, she didn't survive, but she went out with the ride of her life. He was a storyteller.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the stereotypical Irish storyteller. That was him.
Yeah, we lost a legend when he passed on, but boy, did he ever leave behind a legacy.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Without a doubt.
Well, this has been really good. Do you have any other sort of sports stories you'd like to relay before we wrap things up?
No, really, I mean, it's just being a part of small town journalism and having the additional aspect of sports, there are so many people that ride the highs are the highest of highs and the lows are the lowest of lows whenever you're dealing with small communities and their high school sports teams and coaches and players and legends and heroes and all that. You can only think about when we were talking about Mayfield going to the state tournament this year in basketball and how excited everybody was. And then, of course, the legend of Cuba High School basketball team back in the 50s whenever they actually won Kentucky's state championship, and talking about getting the procession that started at Aurora at the Agnes Ferry Bridge, and that they carried that all the way from Marshall County to Mayfield and Graves County, and what a big deal that was. I mean, it's just, there's a certain mythos that's connected to small towns and their high schools and their sports teams and their athletes. There are just so many stories that go along with that. Not only just some that I've known, and some of them have been about people that haven't been maybe reached that level of notoriety, but the things that they did either at one point in time during their careers, is just enough to kind of make people pause every once in a while and stop and say, I remember that game whenever such and such put up 40 points in one game or came back and they were 50 points down in the second half and came back. I mean, those are just one of the added benefits of being a part of and keeping tabs on your local community newspaper and sports journalism. They carry a lot of story and a lot of history and nostalgia with them as well.
Yeah, they really do. I remember somebody once talking to me kind of dismissively about the zeal and the dedication some of these small towns have for their high school sports teams. And meanwhile, he was one of those types who would go to Buffalo Wild Wings Sunday with like a notebook to keep track of every single score that the NFL was having for that day. And I just said, these people with this little bitty high school team that you're poking fun at, their families go there, their friends go there, they grew up there. These NFL teams, what kind of kinship, what kind of relationship do you have with them other than watching them on TV?
Right, yeah. There's a fandom connection there, but it doesn't have the roots that the community has with their local high school.
Yeah, there's really something special to those. And there was a TV show not too long ago, I'm sure you're aware of, Friday Night Lights. I saw that in every episode. I was like, that's my town. That's it.
Yeah.
I know this takes place in Texas, but it's West Kentucky.
That's right. It's certainly Mayfield written all over it.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for joining me. This has been a real great interview. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
Oh, without a doubt.
All right, cool. Well, with that, we will sign off. Thank you again for joining me.
Thank you.
All right, big thanks to Eric Walker for taking some time out of his no doubt very busy schedule to chat with me. When I did the journalism gig full-time, I was always a little bit jealous of the sports reporters. On a daily basis, I got to speak with the city mayor. I spoke with the sheriff. I spoke with the chief of police, judges, and so many people that ran the town and the county, in fact. But small communities, their whole identity is really wrapped up in their schools, specifically in their sports programs. And it's the sports writers that get to really be there for all of that. They get to experience it all firsthand. And it's something that I just never had the opportunity to do. So it would have been cool if I had, but I don't know that I don't think I was really the man to do that job. But it's definitely cool to hear about it from the people that actually did live it. Thank you once again, Eric. That was some really cool stories to hear. And it was cool reminiscing about a local legend like Coach Paul Leahy. So now we'll move on to another part of the show where I answer listener questions. We've actually got a couple this time around. The first one comes from a Rita Grossman. I'm sorry, Rita. I'm sure I'm just butchering your name there. Rita's question is, how come the show only comes out once a month? This is a very simple question with a very simple answer. I have a full-time job, I have a 3-year-old son, and I have a daughter due to be born later this month. So, quite frankly, my schedule is packed, and once a month is all I have time for. However, for what it's worth, we've kind of settled into a pretty firm schedule. I'm putting this thing out the first Tuesday of every month, so mark your calendars, Rita. We also have another question here from a Johnny Popper. Johnny has asked me if I've got a Rob Dollar lined up as a guest. Johnny, I've done some digging around to try to figure out who this Rob Dollar is, and I just can't find him anywhere. So if perchance you can send me a message somehow and let me know, that'd be great. You've piqued my curiosity. I really want to know who this guy is. I'm I'm sure I'm just looking in all of the wrong places and the information is just right under my nose. But if you could lend me a hand, that would be great. So I mentioned earlier in the show that there are some great ways to support us. First and foremost, just to spread the word, but there are some other ones. If you would like to follow our Facebook page, it's facebook.com/Schorr Manor. We've got all kinds of information there about this show, about our Halloween show that my wife and I do, not to mention my webcomic, my ongoing adventure series. You can also find links to our newsletter. A lot of fun stuff there, not to mention a link where you can go and purchase Schorr Manor t-shirts. You can show your friends all how spooky and awesome you are and throw some support behind us that way. That would be fantastic. Not to mention we have a Patreon page, patreon.com/Schorr Manor, where you can throw your support behind this show and others. And I like to think we've got some pretty cool rewards there for anybody who might be interested. And if you want to reach out to me, you can find me on Twitter at the Matt Schorr and on Instagram at the Schorr. And if you'd like to send me a question for this show or anything else, I love hearing from people, you can send me an email at mattschorr@hotmail.com. And finally, I do have a website if you'd like to find out any more additional information about me. It's mattschorr.net. So now as we draw this to a close, I just want to say again how important it is to support your local newspapers. If you happen to live in Mayfield and you subscribe to the Mayfield Messenger, make sure and let Eric know what a great job that he does covering local sports there. His passion for covering all that really shows through when you speak with him. And you know what? If you're not a subscriber to the Mayfield Messenger and you do live in Mayfield, Kentucky, make sure and subscribe. It's so important to support local newspapers. I cannot stress that enough. Thank you again for checking out one more episode. We'll talk to you again. Keep listening and keep reading. Thanks.